Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and tonight we continue on with our series, A Journey to Faith, and we're looking in the book of Joshua at this point in time. The descendant from the genealogy of Jesus who we're following, his name is Salmon, and he's found in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, and it's in verse 4 and 5, as we follow the forefathers of Jesus. Last week we had a look at what happened when the Israelites crossed the Jordan River and went into the land of Canaan for the first time. We learnt about the consecration that occurred before they went into the land by water. We learnt about the crossing and the nature of the crossing and how the water stopped 29 kilometres further to the north at Adam. We learnt about the hill that was created from 1 million odd males being circumcised, a grisly endeavour with a flint knife. But there was a blood covenant that was enacted at that point in time, and these are things that God commanded his people to do before he continued to take them through the land of Canaan, and before they were able to approach Jericho, their first city which they were to overcome. We learnt about the spies last week, the two spies that went into the city and how they escaped. And of course we learnt about the scarlet cord that was hung out from the northern wall of the prostitute's home called Rahab, and how the scarlet cord has an analogy with sin, in the same way that the blood was painted on the doorposts and the lintels when they left Egypt. So this is the second crossing, the second time we have the symbolic mention of the colour red or scarlet or blood. And there's an analogy, of course, with Jesus who will die on the cross in the future. So tonight we're picking up in the book of Joshua, Joshua chapter 5, and the story at this particular point in time is that we haven't actually commenced with the attack on the city of Jericho, but the people who lived in there, no one left or entered because they shut up the city in fear of the pending Israelite invasion. The people of Jericho, they thought they were actually well prepared for the siege, and they had collected their harvest, brought their animals inside, and stored much needed water from the spring inside of the actual walls. Now if you go to Israel today, you'll find out that the actual spring is just outside of the city of Jericho. It's actually not inside in this particular instance. So it's called Elijah's Well. So you may know Elijah's Well from the Bible. You literally come off the Tell, the ancient hill. I'll show you a picture of it tonight. And when you go to where the well is, you literally cross a road today, walk about 100 metres at the most, and there's the actual natural spring of water. So the Bible tells us here that they had to bring the water inside of the city and store it because it was outside. The reason for this is because all the livestock was outside, and it was a means of supplying water to them. Now, the story picks up here where Joshua was confronted by a man holding a drawn sword, who said he was the commander of the army of the Lord in Joshua chapter 5 verse 14. Joshua was told in chapter 6 verse 2, he said, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands along with its king and its fighting men." So what we're learning here from the get-go is that the walls of Jericho and the victory that they're about to receive was not because of a physical army that was invading. It was because the victory was being given to them by God. Now he was instructed to march the armed men around the city once each day for 6 days. They were to escort 7 priests carrying trumpets of ram's horns, what we know as shofars today, and the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant. On the 7th day the same would happen, but instead of walking around once, they would walk around 7 times while the priests blew the trumpets. So I have a picture here which will be posted on the YouTube video, and it just shows the artist's impression of the city there, and you can see the Ark of the Covenant being carried on the shoulders of the priests, the men there in front, the priests blowing the shofars, and of course the army that was walking around behind them. Okay. Joshua returned to the camp, and he told the priests in verse 6 of Joshua 6, "Take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it." He ordered them in verse 7, "Advance, march around the city with the armed guard going ahead of the ark of the Lord." The 7 priests set out blowing their trumpets. They followed the majority of the 40,000 strong armed guard from the tribe of Reuben, Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Behind them were the 4 priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant and the rear guard. Joshua had made one thing quite clear. He said in verse 10 of Joshua chapter 6, "Do not give a war cry, do not raise your voices, do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout, then shout." Why do you think, and this is for everyone online too if you'd like to join in and answer the questions, why do you think they were instructed not to actually shout, not to cry and not to raise their voices? They were to walk around the city for 7 days and yet not make a sound. What effect do you think that that would have on the people inside the city?
I think they're crazy.
They would go crazy? How would it make you feel if you were surrounded by an army walking around?
You'd be questioning, what's going on.
You would, wouldn't you? You'd be
Why
worrying.
are they just walking around?
Right.
Why are they not making any war cries or anything like that?
Right. And 7 days.
Confusion.
So talk about the feeling of pending doom. It doesn't just come in, it's not like a battle where it just comes at you. It actually goes on and on and on. So why do you think they were instructed not to shout though? Look at this from the Lord's side. Why would the instruction tell his people not to do any visible sign of aggression or noise?
Because it's not their war to fight, it's God's war.
Right. And so we just read that the Lord said that he's going to act on this and he's going to do it. So what was he calling his people to do in this instance?
Be obedient.
To be obedient. That's right. So God is always calling his people to follow him and to be obedient to his commands. And he says that he will actually deliver. And so we have a lesson in that alone for ourselves today. When God calls us to do something, don't do it your way. Do it the way that he asks you to do it. And through your obedience to him and his word, he will actually take care of it for you. And so this is a very powerful message for all of us. So, as they headed off to circle around the fortified city, Salmon, one of those men, one of the forefathers of Jesus, was amongst them. So you can imagine what they actually were feeling as they marched around this place. Once they had finished, he returned to camp at Gilgal and rested. Now I'm going to go, not just yet, but in a moment, I'm going to go into the actual city in Israel, the City of Jericho, what it's like today. And I'm going to explain to you the number of people, the size of the city, and you'll be astounded at what this actually looks like, because the city is very small and the actual number of people is very small as well. So this is not about numbers, right? So we'll have a look at that. Also, the other thing is it's called the City of Jericho. So for people who aren't cognizant with the Hebrew language, the word for city is the letters IR, so they pronounce it with a rolling R. So the city doesn't have any other definition. Okay? So whether it's a town, a village or a city, today if I say the word city, you think of skyscrapers, big populations, dense traffic, but cities back then are actually very, very small. And oftentimes in the Bible when we read about the word town or city or village, it's actually not the word in Hebrew that's been given, it's the translation or interpretation of the version of the Bible that you're actually reading. They only had one word and it was called a city. So don't get the impression that when they talk about a city, and the picture that I've shown shows a very vast city with these people marching a long way around, but that's actually not the case. So I'll show a little bit more about that in a moment. So early the next morning they got up, so this is the second day now, and they marched around the city again and returned to camp. They did this for 6 days until on the 7th they were commanded to march around the city 7 times. Salmon had remained quiet with the rest of the Israelites until on the 7th and final circuit, when the priests sounded their trumpet, Joshua commanded them in verse 18 of Joshua 6. He says, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." So there's those words, the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted, or another interpretation, totally destroyed to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. Sorry, that's verses 16 to 17. The soldiers were also told to collect the gold, silver, bronze and iron and put them into the treasury of Joshua. So in verse 18 it goes on and says, "But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them." So we find right in the beginning, when they go into the land, when there's some plunder to be had, they're being instructed not to take it for themselves, because it's not going to bode well. And so it actually says your own destruction. So there's a temptation when they enter the city that they would be able to take something, and they're being warned before they start not to. So Salmon had watched amongst all these people, the 40,000 men and the priests, circling the city walls for 7 days. When Joshua commanded everyone to shout, you can imagine he and everybody else gave it everything that they had. They screamed at the top of their voices, they all yelled. At the sound of the trumpet blast, a rumbling sound grew and grew, and the ground shook until suddenly sections of the wall of Jericho collapsed before them. The sections that fell left gaping holes of rubble, forming ramps that could be climbed up to gain access to the city inside. And this picture and the Bible actually tells us the story of how the walls actually fell down, because it wasn't a complete collapse. There was actually a partial collapse. We know that as well because the northern wall had to remain intact, where Rahab the prostitute and her family lived. And so this is actually what happened. So I'll just pass this around. So the soldiers were scrambled up these slopes and charged inside the city, as you can imagine. Unsheathing their swords from the scabbards, they began their grisly work to slay every man and woman. See, God instructed them not to spare anybody, whether they were old or young. The Israelites, however, grossly outnumbered those inside the walls. So fearful of the Israelites with their mighty God were they, that they either cowered to the ground or screamed and ran. You could just imagine the scene. No quarter was given though, for the Lord demanded all to be slain, even the livestock. While this took place, Joshua was careful to identify the house of Rahab. He would identify it by the scarlet cord in the window, which is written in verse 18, that the 2 spies had used when they'd been let down the outside of the wall. He sent, they found her there, along with her father and mother, her brothers and all those who belonged to her. Escorting them safely outside, they were taken to a place just outside the camp of Israel at Gilgal. So you might remember that Gilgal is located about 10 kilometres north of the city of Jericho, and this is where the Israelites had camped. The slaughter was soon finished, and the Bible tells us that the Israelites then set fire to the city and everything in it. So I'm going to give you a bit of an insight into the city of Jericho itself and what it actually looks like today and what it was like back then, so you can get a picture of how it fell and what the scale of it was. So the culture in the land of Canaan, it was actually fairly advanced. Remember, God said that this was going to be the land of milk and honey. He wasn't bringing them into a barren land. He was bringing them into a place where there were cities, where there was farming, there was crops, there was water, there was animals, livestock for food. And so they were quite advanced. The cities and houses were actually well designed and well built. The floors of the buildings were usually paved or plastered, and drainage systems were well developed. The skill use of metals was prevalent, and pottery was as good as any other part of the world at the time. Trade with other countries was also well developed, for they were known to trade with Egypt, northern Mesopotamia and Cyprus. When the Israelites entered the land of Canaan and attacked Jericho, they literally split the acquisition of the promised land into two. It's literally halfway. So they split the country into north and south where they actually entered it. So bound on one side by the Mediterranean Sea and on the other side by the Jordan River, which was in flood at this point in time, this was actually a strategically clever manoeuvre, because they were going to separate the bodies of people to the north and to the south. Now, after Jerusalem, in today's world, ancient Jericho is a mound or a tell that covers about 9 acres of land with a circumference of 1 kilometre or less. Okay, so it's not very big. It's the next most excavated site outside of Israel itself. You can imagine why. This is one of the most famous of Bible stories, and they wanted to explore it to either determine the truth or not of whether what the Bible says is the case. So the point is that it's actually not a huge city, nor was its population. Now I have a picture here. I hope you can see what I'm holding up. Again, this will go on YouTube. And this is the picture of Jericho today. It's actually called Tel Es Sultan. It's actually a Muslim area inside of the West Bank at this point in time. When you look at this city, we've taken this photo from a sky chair that goes up to the Mount of Temptation behind it, and across the other way where you can see the green just before the horizon, this is where the Jordan River is. So when you look at this picture and you look at those roads and you look at the mound, you can see it's not a massive area at all. And so this is what they were actually going to overcome. We're just up here on the Mount of Temptation at Jericho, looking up through the Jordan Valley, to the Jordan River over there, up towards the Sea of Galilee. So this is Jericho in front of us here, so as you pan around, you can see the escarpment on the other side, Jericho in the foreground. So directly there in the middle is the plains of Moab, Shittim. This is where the Israelites camped before they came to Jericho from the other side. There, immediately below us is the Tell, where Jericho was, the mounds of what looks like mounds of dirt from here. And as we pan around to the right hand side here, in the distance on the horizon there is the Dead Sea. You can see the lack of buildings there and the sandy looking colour and the haze of blue. So that's the Dead Sea there. So we're right at the top of the Dead Sea. We're up on the Mount of Temptation. So this is the place where Jesus was tempted by the devil. There's a monastery up here, a Greek monastery, which we're just going to go up and visit. But this is the place where they came out of the plain. So in the background there in the escarpment is where the Baal of Peor was worshipped. But down there to the right, where they came down, the Israelites, when they come up through Moab, and settled on the plains there. And we pan back around to the left up here, behind all those hills up there. About 10 kilometres up the road is Gilgal, and Gilgal is where the Israelites settled for a period of time while they overcame their land initially, and where they settled and kept the Ark of the Covenant. So we're here on top of the Tell Safaris, they call it here, but this is on top of Jericho, on the ancient city of Jericho. So we're pointing the camera here, looking straight across at Shittim and the plain of Moab. The mountains are barely hard to see behind, but basically this is pointing at Baal of Peor. As they work our way around, you can just sort of see them on the horizon. Over this way we get to Mount Nebo and Mount Pisgah, and you can see all the palms here. This is Jericho with the palms. I'm just going to spin around here. You can see there's a cable car goes up from here over the Tell. And just walk over here as we go from the tell here. We're up at the Mount of Temptation where Jesus was, so that's up there. You can see the Greek monastery up the top. So that's where Jesus went for the 40 days. And when we turn all the way back around here, in this direction we're pointing towards the Dead Sea, and a little bit further around here and we've got Bethany beyond Jordan, which is where Jesus was baptised. So you can sort of see the reference from where he was baptised to where he went for the temptation, and up here in the hills behind Jericho. Just spinning around here, this is the continuation of the tell. So this is the ancient tell of Jericho. It's not a very big one, but nonetheless highly significant in our understanding of biblical history as the entry point where Joshua brought in the Israelites into the Promised Land. Numerous excavations have taken place for many years and continue to this day. It was discovered that there was a mighty spring of water at Jericho, which was rare for this area because this is actually a barren area. This is the area which is classified as the wilderness in the Bible that Jesus was in after he was baptised and was tempted by the devil. The place today, if you go to Israel, that was the Mount of Temptation, is actually directly behind that tell, ancient mound, and that's from where that picture is actually taken. And so it's a very barren area in regards to water itself. So the spring water was absolutely vital. The supply of constant water with arable land around explains why the people settled there and they built a city. And the reservoir of water, as I said earlier, is still there today and is in fact Elijah's well. There are also many large jars full of grain found, not just giving evidence of the harvest, but because they're intact, they give evidence of the cataclysmic event that took place there. In 1952, the director of the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem, a lady by the name of Kathleen Kenyon, she began an excavation program that lasted until 1958. She studied the stratigraphy, noting there was more than one wall. And there's more pictures to come, but the top picture here actually shows the cut that was done in that time, and it exposes all of the various geological structures, the wall, etc. On there, the picture below it shows this wall here, and the wall there is actually on the northern end, on top of the tell today, where Rahab lowered the Israelite spies down. The wall is still there today. It's quite astounding. And so this stratigraphy that's on here, and I'll explain a bit further, it shows this level of paving here at the bottom. There's actually two walls, one had collapsed and one had stayed up, and there's actually some black in here which is a result of fire. Right? So these items that are on here actually explain what the tell was like and what happened to it biblically, because they actually burnt it down. So the ancient cities, the way they were built, they're on top of a huge hill or a mound, and they would have an inner city with a wall where all the inhabitants lived, and there'd be an outer wall which is where they brought the livestock and the people who lived outside the city, and they were able to close those gates so they could protect them in times of need. And so this place was like many. It had two sets of walls with a rising mound behind it, which made it pretty impenetrable in those days. So this embankment or earthen rampart was supported by a stone retaining wall, and it measured to 4 to 5 metres high, and on top of this was another mud brick wall 2 metres high. So going up to the top of the embankment was another mud brick wall which sat about 14 metres above the same ground level the stone retaining wall sat on. So you can hear by all those measurements, this was one really extremely high wall which wasn't possible to scale. So for the Israelites themselves, it would have been impossible to penetrate it just by arriving there. Inside the upper wall, as I said, the area is estimated to cover roughly 6 acres, and adding the area between the walls is a further 3 acres. So the archaeologists who have worked on this site have determined that a population of roughly 200 people per acre is the maximum to be able to support. So the upper city contained a population of only 1,200 people, However, with the people coming on the embankment between the two walls, it would have increased its population to no more than a few thousand people, 3,000 to 4,000 people. So you can picture this. A couple of million Israelites have just come across the Jordan River. 40,000 Israelite soldiers were walking silently around this city, which is less than a kilometre long, and you've got 3,000 to 4,000 people inside. They would have been absolutely petrified. They would have no hope of beating this crowd of people. This archaeological understanding and the size of the geography of the place gives us a better picture of what it would have really been like in the day, because it wasn't Israelites going around this massive structure. In fact, it had high walls, but it was a very small place with a small population. Now you've got to remember, out of that population of 3,000 or 4,000 people, how many of them would have actually been soldiers? It would have been very small in number. And so this wasn't a war of might or scale. This was about obedience to God. And so God told them how they were to go about doing this. So the evidence shows the walls of Jericho did not fall down. Oh, sorry, beg your pardon, I shouldn't say that. This archaeological evidence shows that the walls did fall down and that a fire actually followed. Kathleen Kenyon wrote, "The destruction was complete. Walls and floors were blackened or reddened by fire, and every room was filled with fallen bricks, timbers, and household utensils. In most rooms, the fallen debris was heavily burnt." So debate today continues on how the walls actually collapsed. The most common explanation is an earthquake, because Jericho is situated in the Rift Valley. I spoke about this last week, about how when you go down from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea, it's the lowest point on earth. And so this is a subduction zone where two plates, instead of buckling upwards to form a mountain, one goes under the other and it clefts the earth and forms a low spot. And so this is the point where the city's sitting on. So this is a known area where, as the earth plates continue to move, even till today, there's seismic activity, there's earthquakes and tremors and the like. So when the walls fell down, you look at that picture, there's sections that are remaining, sections that are missing. It actually shows you the effects of a seismic activity, because it has a sine wave, which means it shakes it, sections fall down and the other parts actually remained up. The sections that fell down provided ramps of rubble in order for the soldiers to get up inside, whilst these other sections remained upright. And of course, the incredible thing when we look at God's hand on this is that the particular section that they wanted to preserve is still there to this day, and that's the northern wall where Rahab the prostitute lived. So extraordinarily, examination of the site reveals that a portion of the wall on the northern side of the tell remains standing. So this is this second picture here. So again, this will be posted with the video, but this picture here, this wall, this is there today. This is what's left of the wall. So we're talking a long time ago. We're talking about when they went into Jericho. Okay, so we're talking about 3,500 years ago, and this wall is still standing. Fire, collapsed walls, paving, and as they dug this site, they found all the utensils and bricks and all the rest of it. So it paints a really strong picture, and this is why it's the most excavated site after Jerusalem itself. So I'll pass that picture around. This astounding discovery aligns with the Holy Bible, because we know Rahab's house was built into the walls of the city and that she was spared. What we can understand from this is that no matter what method God used to stop the flow of the Jordan River and destroy the walls of Jericho, we can see God's miraculous power, as these events happened at exactly the right time they were needed, and they occurred in such a way that Rahab's house was protected. We also see how it was by faith that the Israelite people, following the commands of the Lord, brought the walls down. There's a chapter in the New Testament that we know as the book of Hebrews, and it has a chapter in there called, it's all about faith, and so that is chapter 11. So in Hebrews chapter 11 verse 30, it says, "By faith the walls of Jericho fell, after the people had marched around them for 7 days." And again in verse 31, "And by faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient." So the Bible reflects and tells us that this was an issue of faith and obedience. A good lesson for all of us to this day. It's a bit hard to not say anything at the moment, isn't it? Because the world is being beset by the coronavirus, and there is a lot of fear, understandably, going around. It's almost like we're in World War III at the moment, because this is global. This is probably the first large, truly global event that struck fear in the hearts of mankind, that's separated it from any other event between World War II and now. And so we find at this point in time, it challenges us in our faith, because medical advice tells us that we need to socially isolate, and there's a range of functions that we need to do about our hygiene, which is all good and very wise to do. But at the same time, it challenges our faith about whom God is in our lives and how obedient we are to His word. And so we have to place ourselves under the wing of our mighty God. We have to have faith that God is going to protect us. Without faith, nothing will happen. And so we find in this situation, it's very hard not to reflect on current times. And we also find that God uses many natural means in the Bible when He goes about His business here on earth. The Bible talks about pestilence, plagues, etc. We can't define whether that's the case, because we all understand where it came from. However, it is going around this planet, and so we have this moment in time here where as people we have to remain faithful and we have to remain obedient to God's word. One of the interesting things about this time is there'll be a lot of people who are searching their hearts right now, because it's only in times when things go really wrong that many people go searching for God. They say things like, "If there is a God, please save me." They don't know God, they don't walk about God, but suddenly they recognise that perhaps there is a God. And so at this point in time, as Christians, we should all be doing our best to share the gospel and to minister to people and to help people and show God's love at this time, and understand that our obedience to Him and our faith to Him will have results which will change the face of this planet. Right now, there's people, I receive messages from people online all over the world who are hunkering down, who've got no work, who are just packing up and going home, being told to stay separate. And so of course we have this fear. We have a silent pandemic. It's funny, we're talking about Jericho, and those men walked around the city of Jericho and they said nothing. So everybody inside knew something was going to happen, but they didn't know when it was going to happen. So you can imagine the panic and the fear that they were actually feeling. And so this pandemic, which is a silent killer today, is affecting everybody. And yet the numbers versus our whole planet are very, very small. And so we need to have a little bit of courage at the moment, and we need to pray to God to stop this from going any further. Okay, so back to the lesson. So having destroyed the fortress city of Jericho, its Amorite king, army and people, the passes to the central hill country were left open to the Israelites. Joshua sent men west from Jericho to another city called Ai, spelled A-I, which was just east of Bethel, which is the house of God. Remember, Beth means house, El is the ancient word for God. So he sent them to this city called Ai, which was just near Bethel. And he said to them in Joshua chapter 7, verse 2, "Go up and spy out the region." So once again, he sends spies up front to see what's actually going on. Sending his army through the central pass to Bethel, Joshua would gain access to the plateau region to the south and the central hill country to the north, essentially conquering the heartland of Canaan. Overcoming Ai was essential to do this, as it guarded the pass to Bethel. So you can see that there's no random thing going on here. There's a very specific plan that's being followed, and this plan is being given to them by the Lord. So the spies told Joshua this place was actually of little significance. They said in verse 3 of Joshua 7, "For only a few men are there." So Joshua sent up 3,000 men only to have them beaten. They were chased from the gates of the city to some stone quarries further down the slope. 36 men were killed, and Joshua became dismayed. Beaten by these Amorites from Ai, doubt began to creep in and overwhelm Joshua, so he petitioned the Lord and learnt his men failed because God was not with them. The Lord said to Joshua in Joshua 7 verses 11 to 12, "Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things, they have stolen, they have lied, they have put them with their own possessions. That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies." So you may remember just before they went into the city of Jericho, they were told that everything that they plundered was to be taken to put amongst the treasury of Joshua, their leader. They were not to keep anything themselves. So we find here that these 3,000 men went up to take on this small army in a small city, and they lost, and God says that he wasn't with them, and the reason he wasn't was because of sin, and the sin was because they actually took these things they weren't meant to and kept them for themselves. And so we find straight away they've just consecrated themselves to God. God just stopped the waters so they could cross the Jordan River. They were circumcised and enacted a blood covenant with God. The city of Jericho was overtaken, and straight away these men are already sinning and taking care of themselves. So they're being disobedient in this point in time, and so there's a punishment that God brings upon them. So Salmon was called to assembly with the Israelite people. Joshua addressed them in chapter 7 verse 13. And he said, "Consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, that which is devoted is among you, O Israel. You cannot stand against your enemies until you remove it." So they're talking about these people who have taken these items they're not meant to have, and he's saying that you can't go and fight your enemies until you get rid of these people who have sinned. So he went on to say in verses 14 to 15, "In the morning present yourselves tribe by tribe. The tribe that the Lord takes shall come from clan by clan. The clan that the Lord takes shall come forward family by family. And the family that the Lord takes shall come forward man by man." This scripture gives us an order. It gives us a sense of how the society is actually organised. It talks about tribes, then clans, then families, and then individuals. "He who is caught with a devoted thing shall be destroyed by fire. Along with all that belongs to him, he has violated the covenant of the Lord and has done a disgraceful thing in Israel." Now you notice there he said he's done a disgraceful thing in Israel. So here's the first instance in the Bible, in this little scripture, that actually names Israel, Israel for the first time. Because up until now, it's been called the land of Canaan. Now that they've actually consecrated themselves to God and they've gone into the land, and they've conquered the first city, it's now known as Israel. So when the Lord gave the Israelites the city of Jericho, Joshua had given the Lord's command to them. So this is that scripture, just to remind you, from Joshua 6 verse 18 to 19. "Keep away from the devoted things, that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury." So by disobeying God's covenant or instruction, by taking that which was devoted to him, meaning God, although only the act of an individual, the effect was to bring a curse upon the whole nation of Israel. As the crowd dispersed, everybody did what they were told. They all had to take their turn. He went to bathe and wash his clothes in preparation for the next day. There was chatter through the camp. People would have been anxious because no one wanted to be destroyed by fire. So you can imagine at this point in time, no one knew who had actually taken it, only those who had taken it. So there would have been a lot of apprehension. So early the next morning, Salmon would have assembled with his tribe, which of course is the tribe of Judah. He was shocked when they came forward to find that the offender was actually from the tribe of Judah. Next, they were asked to come forward in their clans, and the Bible tells us in Numbers chapter 26 verses 20 to 21 that the clans were divided up into the Shelonites, the Perizzites and the Zerahites. The Perizzites were further divided into Hezronites and Hamulites. And Salmon was a descendant of Hezron, who was a descendant of Perez. So he came forward with the clan known as the Hezronites. Relief would have flooded through his clan when the Zerahites were called forward family by family. But when the family of Zimri was taken, there would have been a gasp heard as they realised that this was the family of their own leader, Joshua. When the men of this family came forward one by one, Achan, spelled A-C-H-A-N, the son of Carmi, who was the son of Zimri, was called out. Verse 17, it says, "Not a man remained in Ai or Bethel who did not go up after Israel." So with the previous attack on the Amorites at Ai thwarted, the Amorites must have expected another attack by a greater number of Israelite soldiers, for the men from Bethel had joined them. So we learn that their numbers were much larger this time. So the previous night, Joshua had sent 30,000 of his best fighting men to sit in ambush behind the city. He sent a further 5,000 to the west of the city between Ai and Bethel to wait in ambush. When night fell, Joshua led his men into the valley. So you can see this time that they're very organised and they've planned the actual way that they're going to capture these people in this city. So they would have been sitting patiently in this darkness. At this point in time, you've got to realise too that these soldiers are pretty battle hardened. They've been through quite a few battles by this stage, so they're no longer new at this. And they're used to winning because the Lord was on their side. But obviously there's always this apprehension for people going into battle. So as the sun rose in the east and the shadows cleared from the valley in the early morning, the king of Ai saw the Israelites ready for battle. He led all of his men from within his city walls in a rush to engage the Israelites in battle. They had easily overcome the Israelites that had come against them previously, and even killed a few as they fled. But this was different this time. Even though the Israelites were much smaller in stature, their numbers were vast. Remember, the Bible tells us that these people, the Amorites, were all giants. So Salmon and his men were ordered to stand fast until the Amorites reached them and breached their lines. As I said, these men were huge, like their people. He had fought at Jahaz and Edrei on the other side of the Jordan River. They remained in their positions until the ram horn trumpets were sounded, whereupon they turned and fled towards the desert as if they were being driven back. So in other words, they're playing the same game that happened before, because these people expected that this is what was going to happen. The Lord said to Joshua in verse 18 of Joshua chapter 8, "Hold out toward Ai the javelin that is in your hand, for into your hand I will deliver the city." So the morning sun glinted off the shaft. The signal was seen by the Israelites waiting in ambush. They rose quickly and entered the city, which was now defenceless. They quickly captured it and put it to the torch. So the men from Ai and Bethel, they faltered at this point in time, because they were looking back to where they come from, and they saw the smoke from their city billowing in the sky. Realising they'd been lured from the city, they turned to find the fleeing Israelites had turned back to attack them. As they reeled back in surprise, the Israelites who had taken the city were also racing down towards them. They were caught in the middle. There's a ferocious fight, and of course the Bible tells us there was no survivors. When they stopped, the king of Ai had been captured and was being roughly shoved towards Joshua. They were ordered to return to Ai and kill any survivors who were left, the women, the children and the elderly. Now, just before I finish, I forgot to pass this around, but I have a map here of the land of Israel, and again this will be posted onto YouTube. But what it shows is, it shows where they came across the Jordan River, down here, and Jericho is down here, and how they were going up to this place called Ai, which is near Bethel, and then later on they're going to go further up towards Shechem, which is where next week's lesson will take us to. But this is just to give you a visual understanding on whereabouts they're actually moving, so I'll just pass that around. So they were ordered to return to Ai and kill any survivors who were left. We're talking about the children, the women and the elderly. 12,000 Amorites were killed that day. So you can see the scale of the battle. It says that 30,000 of them went, of the Israelites, and there was 12,000 Amorites that were killed. So again, they heavily outnumbered them. Joshua told them that they could share in the spoil. So this was different to the previous time. He said they could share in the spoil. So they plundered the city and they carried off the livestock. But remember, they also killed the livestock in Jericho. Ai was burnt and left a ruin. Joshua hung the king of Ai on a tree and left him there until evening. At sunset, his body was taken down from the tree, thrown down at the entrance to the city gate and covered by a pile of rocks. So in Joshua chapter 8 verse 29, it says the king of Ai was hung or impaled on a tree or a pole. The people of Canaan were cursed by God, for they practice abominable things: human sacrifice, temple prostitution and the worship of false gods. The kings of each of these city-states were actually responsible for this. Remember, the king of a city-state is the king of his own entity, of his own domain. So if these practices are going on, it's underneath the rule of that particular king. So not only were they executed for the vengeance of God, but also to strike terror into the other kings who had heard their defeat and subsequent execution. So they targeted the kings themselves to strike fear into the hearts of the other kings. The king was killed before being hung. But there's a law that God has about people being hung or impaled on a piece of wood. And this, of course, is tied to the story of Jesus himself. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 21, verses 22 to 23, God's law says, if a man guilty of a capital offence is put to death and his body is hung on a tree, you must not leave his body on the tree overnight. Be sure to bury him that same day, because anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. You must not desecrate the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. So you may remember when Jesus was crucified, it was imperative that they took his body down and that he was buried by dusk. And this was because of this curse. Okay? You might remember when Jesus was on the cross, he actually said, "Why have you forsaken me?" He obviously felt cursed hanging upon that tree. He died on there. But the Jewish people, understanding God's law, ensured that he was taken down and he was buried before dusk. So Bethel was named by Jacob after the Lord told him in Genesis chapter 28 verse 13, "I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying." Jacob said in Genesis 28:17, "This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." So the name of Bethel means the house of God. So after overcoming the Amorites and conquering the cities of Ai and Bethel, because you have to understand that even though they went to battle against Ai, because all the people came down from Bethel, they now have taken out that location as well. So they've now taken 3 cities. So Joshua commanded the people of Israel to journey northwards through the hill country to a place called Mount Ebal, where he will build an altar, and when they arrive, they are going to be required to assemble in front of Mount Gerizim. So next week, this is where we bring it to a close today. So next week we're going to have a look at what happens there. This is the part where we learn about the tribes of Israel who are cursed and the tribes of Israel who are blessed. And they're actually separated onto 2 different sides of the mountains. And so it's quite a fascinating lesson. At this point in time, the Israelites are firmly in the land. Their reputation will be spreading as they conquer these different cities, and they're now heading northwards across the top of the hill country. So you'll see as they travel through the country and they conquer it, they actually move throughout the hill country, not along the plains against the coast of the Mediterranean. And this is because along the hill country, this is where all these Canaanite cities were, and these are the cities that were formerly under the overlords from the other side, the King Sihon and King Og, that they conquered in the beginning. So thank you for joining us tonight. We'll be broadcasting the same time next week, so we look forward to having your company then. God bless you.